Hello everyone, tonight we're beginning with a kind of honor you really don't want, being handpicked to die for the greater good. From being dressed up like a god you'll never get to serve, to being starved into a state that makes you look spiritually pure, to the slow, deliberate walk toward the place where someone has been sharpening a blade just for you. This is the ancient career path with no retirement plan. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy wandering through history's darker corridors with me. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always imagine these stories being told to a scattered circle of night owls. So, dim the lights, maybe pour some tea, or just let the quiet hum of your room become part of the story. Tonight, we're walking side by side with the person you could have been, the one whose last sunrise was scheduled months in advance. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, not the one scrolling through their phone in bed at midnight, but the one hand-picked, hand-selected to die for the good of the cosmos, or the king, or the weather, or whatever the priests decided that week. You wouldn't have been special in the modern sense, with a hashtag and a brand deal. No, your prestige would have been quieter, heavier, and much less negotiable. You'd have been the prize in a contest you never entered, the solution to a problem you didn't cause. In the Aztec world, maybe you'd have been plucked from a captured enemy army, one of those unfortunate flower war survivors. You'd have been kept alive, not because they liked you, but because they had plans. Long-term plans, months, even years of knowing you were just a very elaborate offering. Like the turkey you fatten up before the feast, but let roam the yard for a while, so it doesn't suspect a thing. And in case you're wondering, yes, they would have told you. Not directly with, hey, you're going to die in August, but with all the subtlety of giving you a name like Tezcatlipoca's double, and dressing you in God's clothes. In the Inca Empire, it could have been even trickier. You might have been born into a perfectly respectable Andean family, only to have some imperial envoy knock at your door one day, all smiles, and say your child is honored to be chosen for Kapakikuka. Translation: the gods love them so much, they want them permanently. And unlike in the movies, there wasn't much screaming or running. The family might have cried, yes, but they also knew refusal was unwise. Saying no to the sapper, Inca, was like saying no to gravity. It just wasn't going to work out. And don't think being chosen meant you'd get a say. This wasn't a volunteer sign-up sheet. It was an appointment you couldn't cancel. In some places, like ancient Carthage, there's debate among historians about whether parents actually offered their children willingly. Some sources, biased as they were, describe ceremonies where the wealthy would hand over their infants to be burned for the god Ba al-Hammon. The practice was framed as noble, cleansing, even necessary to keep the city in the god's good graces, which sounds impressive, until you remember that noble here meant on fire. Being chosen wasn't just about you, it was about everyone else. Your body was currency in the divine economy, and your life was an IOU someone else had written to the gods. Whether you were a war captive, a noble child, or the unlucky winner of a prophetic dream, the result was the same. The date of your death was a matter of public record, long before you could wrap your head around it. And here's the part that would really get under your skin. Literally, every person around you would know. You'd walk through your village, your palace, and people would smile, that awkward smile that says, "We respect you, but we also know exactly where you'll be next solstice, and it's not here." The children might look at you like you were already a ghost. The elders might pat your shoulder with that soft, pitying tap that says, "You're part of something bigger," when what they mean is you're about to be part of something dead. The irony. They'd call it an honor. They'd tell you you're the bridge between the human and the divine, the chosen messenger, the beautiful offering. And maybe part of you would want to believe it. Maybe part of you would believe it, because otherwise, well, the alternative is staring down the months ahead, knowing you're just walking the slowest plank in history. And the thing about that plank is it doesn't lead straight to the end. No, it starts with preparation, which is where the real dismantling of you begins. Once your fate was sealed, it wasn't just your problem anymore. The whole community carried it, though not evenly. Some wore it like a badge of collective pride, others like an invisible stone in their gut. In the Aztec capital, your selection could be announced with all the pomp of a military parade, drums echoing across the marketplace, conch shells blaring, and a priest declaring that you'd been chosen by the gods, in a voice that sounded suspiciously like an order. People clapped, people cried, and a few people probably avoided eye contact entirely, the way we do when we pass someone who's clearly on their way to somewhere we'd rather not think about. In the Inca highlands, the Copacoca procession might start right at your family's doorstep. Officials would arrive in regal textiles, their presence as official as it was final. Neighbors would gather not to protest, but to witness, because your departure was now a public ritual. Your parents might receive gifts, silver ornaments, fine cloth that were meant to show gratitude, but in reality just looked like very polite payment for the loss of their child. The transaction was dressed up in sacred language, but the exchange was clear. And here's the part that still baffles modern sensibilities. In many places, the family was expected to act honored. Public grief had limits. Too much crying could imply that you doubted the necessity of the sacrifice, which was dangerously close to doubting the gods themselves. So you'd get this strained theater of acceptance: mothers brushing your hair with shaking hands, fathers reciting blessings while their knuckles whitened, all under the gaze of officials making sure no one broke the script. The Maya added their own layer of social expectation. In certain rituals, the chosen person wasn't just dying for the gods, they were dying for everyone else's sins. That meant every shopkeeper, every farmer, every half-drunk uncle in town could look at you and think, yes, my bad luck is about to be fixed by you bleeding on a temple floor. You became a walking insurance policy. The weight of that wasn't metaphorical, it was the way people looked at you, like you already carried their problems on your shoulders. Among Polynesian islanders who practiced human sacrifice, the social logic was just as binding. The individual was seen as property of the gods long before the knife touched skin. Once that decision was made, you were off the human market entirely. Conversations about you shifted from "what will they do next" to "when will the ceremony be?" The answer was always soon enough to keep everyone slightly on edge. The real cruelty here wasn't only in what was coming, but in the fact that your existence from that point on was curated by public expectation. Strangers would approach you not to offer escape, but to give advice on how to die well, how to stand, how to breathe, how not to embarrass your village in front of the gods. You weren't allowed to have a bad day. You couldn't snap at someone in the street. You couldn't trip and fall without someone reading it as a bad omen. And the strange thing is, the community needed you as much as you now depended on them. You were their living ticket to divine favor, their way of proving loyalty, their shield against whatever cosmic disaster they feared most, which meant that, until the very end, they'd keep you close, but never quite too close. Affection was rationed. After all, why get too attached to someone you'd soon be chanting over? The next stage made that closeness even stranger because it was time to start reshaping you, body and soul, into the perfect gift. That began with what they took away first: food. The first thing they'd do is strip you gently, ceremonially, but completely of anything resembling an ordinary human appetite. Not because they cared about your waistline, but because the gods apparently didn't like offerings who smelled like onions and beer. In the Aztec world, this meant your meals became an exercise in restraint. No spicy stews, no rich tamales, just bland maize, maybe a pinch of herbs if someone was feeling generous. You weren't eating to live anymore. You were eating to transition into something else. The Inca Copacoca ceremonies took it further. For weeks, sometimes months, you'd be on a diet of sacred foods: roasted corn, dried meat, and chicha fermented maize beer, not for pleasure, but to prepare your body. Every sip and bite had symbolic weight, which meant you couldn't just sneak an extra mouthful without insulting the mountain spirits. And yes, there were people watching to make sure you didn't. Purification wasn't limited to what went in your mouth. The Maya, for instance, might bathe you in sacred water daily, sometimes with herbal infusions meant to cleanse the soul. In Polynesian rites, victims were sometimes massaged with scented oils to make them more pleasing to the gods, though pleasing was a relative term when the end goal was to kill you. In the ancient Mediterranean, there are accounts of bathing victims in seawater or temple cisterns, the salt supposedly scrubbing away spiritual impurities. It wasn't spa day, it was pre-slaughter hygiene. Fasting always came with the other half of the package: abstinence. In many cultures, you were expected to avoid sex entirely before the ceremony. For the Aztec, simply those who impersonated gods before their deaths, it was strictly forbidden. Not out of prudishness, but because spilling certain bodily fluids apparently diminished the purity of the blood offering. So while you might have been dressed like a deity, you weren't allowed any of the perks. And the thing about fasting is that it sharpens the mind in ways you don't necessarily want before a ceremonial execution. Hunger narrows your world down to essentials. You can feel every grain of maize in your stomach, hear your own pulse in your ears, and smell food from impossible distances. The body is louder when it's deprived, and with every growl of your stomach, you'd be reminded that your body wasn't yours anymore. It belonged to the ritual. This slow deprivation had another purpose. It made you visibly different. Your cheeks hollowed, your eyes sharpened, your skin took on a certain tautness. It wasn't starvation, they wanted you alive and walking, but it was enough to make you look otherworldly. Among the Inca, this was ideal. The sacrifice was supposed to appear serene, unworldly, already halfway to the mountain spirits. Among the Aztecs, the Ixiptla's transformation into a god's image was both physical and symbolic, and fasting was part of that sculpting process. You might have thought this was the worst of it, the gnawing hunger, the endless rituals, the loss of control over even the smallest human pleasures. But this was only the prelude, because after weeks of hollowed-out living, the priests didn't just want you clean, they wanted you to look like you belonged to someone else entirely, which is where the costuming began. By the time they were done feeding you bland maize and bathing you in sacred water, you were less a person and more a blank canvas, and the priests were ready to paint. Literally, in Mesoamerica, they'd start with pigments, deep reds from crushed cochineal insects, bright yellows from flowers, black lines drawn with charcoal or soot. This wasn't decoration, it was ownership. Once those colors were on your skin, you weren't you anymore. You were the walking embodiment of a god, a spirit, or an ancestor who demanded the dignity of a well-prepared corpse. In the Aztec capital, if you were the Ixiptla god stand-in, you'd be dressed head to toe in their regalia. Feathers from tropical birds that took weeks to collect, gold ornaments that gleamed under the sun, and masks carved so intricately you'd swear they could breathe. You didn't get to pick your outfit, of course. If the god wore jaguar pelts, you wore jaguar pelts, even if it meant sweating yourself into dehydration. If the god wore a headdress heavy enough to give you neck pain for days, so be it. After all, the divine's temporary Airbnb. The Inca Capacoca ceremonies dressed their child sacrifices in the finest Kumbi cloth, soft enough to rival silk, dyed in royal colors reserved for the elite. Tiny gold and silver figurines were placed with you, as if your wardrobe needed accessories to impress the mountain gods. You'd be wrapped in layers of textiles against the cold, not for your comfort, but to preserve the offering until the moment came. The more elaborate the wrapping, the clearer the message. This wasn't just a body, it was a gift worth keeping. Among the Maya, victims destined for decapitation might be adorned with jade beads, seashell necklaces, and embroidered garments, items chosen as much for their symbolic meaning as for their beauty. The green of jade was life, the seashells a whisper from the underworld, the patterns in the cloth a kind of coded prayer. And if you were Polynesian, you might be oiled until you glistened, crowned with woven garlands, and fitted with ceremonial mats or cloaks that proclaimed your role as property of the gods. This transformation had a strange double effect. On one hand, it elevated you. You were no longer a nameless human, but the central figure in a cosmic drama. On the other, it erased you entirely. Your friends and family might still recognize your face, but they'd be looking at someone who was officially not you anymore. You were a stand-in, a symbol, an object with legs, and that was the point. The clothing and paint didn't just prepare you for the gods, they prepared everyone else to stop seeing you as someone they could save. Once you looked like a deity, trying to pull you out of the line would be like snatching an idol off an altar. It just wasn't done. The transformation made your death inevitable in the eyes of the crowd, and inevitability is a powerful prison. Still, they weren't finished. Dressing you was one thing, keeping you in that state until the appointed day was another. Which meant the next step wasn't about what you wore at all, it was about where they kept you. And that, of course, meant isolation. Once the paint dried and the ornaments settled against your skin, you didn't get sent home to enjoy a last stroll through the marketplace. No, your new role came with new housing arrangements, and home was now whatever space the priests decided you wouldn't escape from. Sometimes that meant a walled courtyard where the sun reached you for only a few hours a day. Sometimes it meant a shadowed chamber in the temple complex, where incense never stopped burning and the air felt older than you were. If you were meant to stand in for a deity, this seclusion served a purpose. It kept you away from anything that could tarnish your perfection. No contact with the sick. No accidental brush with the blood of an animal. No bumping into people who might remind you of who you were before all this. The body was to remain pure, the spirit unshaken, the appearance untouched. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of putting the wedding dress in a dust-proof bag, except you were the dress, and the wedding ended in your funeral. There were guards, of course. Not the kind that chatted with you or slipped you food, but the kind whose eyes measured every movement, the way one watches a jar about to fall from a shelf. Their job wasn't just to keep you on it, was to keep the rest of the world out. No one could risk you being corrupted by gossip, bad omens, or even a whiff of rebellion. If a cousin showed up begging for a visit, they'd be turned away. If a childhood friend tried to slip past the gate, they'd be escorted out before you could even wave. Inside this confinement, your days blurred. Time wasn't marked by meals anymore. Those were already sparse but by the rhythm of chants, drifting in from the outer halls. Priests passed through to inspect you, adjust your attire, murmur prayers, or just stand in silence like they were making sure you hadn't spoiled. Sometimes they'd burn resins that left your head swimming, your sense of place unraveling until you couldn't quite remember how long you'd been there. In some traditions, you weren't entirely alone. You might share the space with other chosen ones, each dressed, painted, and prepared just as carefully as you. But this didn't make it comforting. Conversation was rare. You all knew why you were there, and there was an unspoken rule against speaking about it. Companionship existed in proximity, not in words. The irony is that this isolation was as much for the community as it was for you. By removing you from daily life, they eased the village or city into the idea that you were already gone. You stopped appearing in the marketplace, stopped walking familiar paths, stopped being a face in the crowd. People adjusted to your absence before you'd even left, and when the day finally came to bring you out, it wasn't like stepping into freedom. It was more like being unwrapped for display, because the next stage wasn't about stillness anymore. It was about movement, the slow and deliberate walk toward where the end would happen. By the time you were led out of that cloistered space, the world outside would feel sharper, almost aggressive, colors too bright, sounds too loud, the air too alive for someone who'd been reduced to incense and whispered prayers. But the real shock wasn't the sunlight, it was the sudden reminder that every pair of eyes was on you. Not in the way people glance at a stranger in the street, but in the way they look at a storm cloud, wondering if it's going to break in their direction. You'd been told this was an honor, the ultimate act of service. But honor is a tricky thing when the countdown is measured in heartbeats. Somewhere in that quiet chamber you'd already done the math. Every sunrise you saw was one less you'd have. And now, out in the open, the awareness was unbearable and strangely theatrical, because you couldn't just show fear. The role required composure. A trembling lip might be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as a bad omen. Some days, the weight pressed in gently, like damp cloth on the skin. Other days, it dropped like a stone in the stomach. Sleep wasn't always an option. You might lie awake listening to the muted chanting from the temple halls, or to the faint hum of the city beyond the walls, thinking about all the people eating, drinking, laughing, people who would still be there when you were nothing more than ash, bone, or a name recited in ceremony. In cultures where the chosen were kept for weeks or months, the anticipation was almost its own form of execution. If you'd been taken in war, you might still hold a thread of defiance, but that thread thinned fast when every day you saw priests adjusting the altar where your body would soon be placed. If you'd been raised for this role, it was different. You'd grown up with the quiet knowledge that your life was just the preface to a single moment. That didn't make it easier. It only meant you'd had longer to imagine it in detail. And imagination was its own cruelty. You knew the method. Everyone knew, whether it was the blade, the cord, the fall, the cold, your mind would run it again and again, filling in gaps with whatever nightmares it could invent. Even if you tried to block it out, the rituals around you were constant reminders, the sharpening of tools, the preparation of the space, the rehearsed movements of the people who would be closest to you in your final moments. Yet here's the bitter twist: fear wasn't just tolerated, it was useful. That tremor in your voice, that stiffness in your step, it could be spun into a sign of divine possession, proof that the gods were already working through you. The line between terror and holiness blurred, and you were never sure which one they wanted more. Still, as heavy as that dread was, it didn't stay locked inside forever. Eventually, It had to move, to spill into the next act. And that act was public, because no matter how private your fears had been, the next stage was designed so that every single person could see you carry them. If you thought they'd bundle you quietly to your destination, you've misunderstood the point entirely. Your final walk wasn't just a transfer from one location to another, it was an event. Part parade, part sermon, part countdown clock. Every step was orchestrated to make sure everyone saw you, and more importantly, saw what you represented. It started with the sound. Drums, always the drums, low and steady at first, then building until you felt them in your ribs. In some places, flutes joined in, piping those sharp, shrill notes that could make the hair on your arms stand up. The music didn't soothe, it drove you forward. And if you hesitated, there were hands light enough to pretend they were guiding, firm enough to remind you there was no turning back. The route wasn't chosen for convenience. It wound through the busiest parts of the city or village, so that merchants, children, soldiers, and old women carrying baskets could stop and watch. People stepped aside, not in silence but in a chorus of chants or cries, depending on the tradition. Some voices were reverent, others almost gleeful, because to them, you weren't a person anymore. You were the living promise of rain, of victory, of a good harvest. Along the way, you might be made to perform symbolic acts. In certain highland rituals, the chosen would scatter offerings grains, flowers, or coca leaves onto the ground as they walked. In coastal ceremonies, you might carry a small effigy or vessel to be placed at the sacrificial site alongside you. These gestures were meant to show the gods you were already participating in the offering, not just enduring it. And always, there was the climb. Many sacrificial sites sat above the surrounding landscape, temple steps, rising in geometric precision, or natural peaks whose paths twisted ever upward. Each step made your legs heavier, not just from the slope, but from the weight of all those eyes below, looking up as you rose into the role you could no longer refuse. In some cases, you could see the platform or altar long before you reached it, a fixed point that never moved closer fast enough to end the waiting, yet never stayed far enough to feel safe. If the offering took place far from the city, the march could last days, even weeks. In certain mountain rituals, the journey itself was part of the sacrifice, thin air biting your lungs, wind burning your cheeks, cold working its way into your bones. By the time you reached the final spot, you weren't just physically exhausted, you were already half given over to the gods by sheer depletion. But here's the part that sealed it. The crowd didn't follow to witness the whole thing. Often, only the appointed officials, the ritual specialists, and perhaps a select few witnesses saw the final stage. For everyone else, the sight of you disappearing into the temple or fading into the distance was the end of their participation. You, however, still had one last audience waiting, those who would stand close enough to hear the final sounds you made, and they'd be ready, instruments in hand, to make sure your voice didn't carry too far. By the time you reached the place where the air itself felt ceremonial, the sound would already be waiting for you, thick, layered, and inescapable. Music wasn't an accessory to the sacrifice. It was the architecture that held it up. The moment you stepped into that space, it wrapped around you, filling every gap that fear hadn't already claimed. The instruments varied, but the intent was the same, to summon attention from both the human and the divine. In the great city-states of central Mexico, there were the huetl drums, large, deep, and slow enough to make your chest vibrate with each striko, accompanied by rattles and shells, ankle bells that kept the rhythm in constant motion. Further south, in stone plazas shadowed by stepped pyramids, conch shells were blown in long, mournful blasts that could sound like either a welcome or a warning. Elsewhere in the world, the soundscape shifted. In Polynesian rites, the sharp call of the pukong trumpet marked the moments when the gods were thought to be most present, punctuating chants that could stretch on for hours. In Andean ceremonies high above the valleys, the putatua horn made from a seashell would answer the wind itself, its note carrying farther than a human voice ever could. Then there were the chants. These weren't the soft, meditative hums you might imagine. They were structured, relentless, often in a call and response that left no room for silence. Every syllable was a piece of the offering, names of deities, recited lineages, cosmic instructions. In some traditions, your own name or the divine name you'd been given would be repeated, binding you more tightly to the god you were meant to embody. The effect was total. If the march had stripped you of your sense of self, The sound here dissolved whatever remained. The beat kept your body moving even if your mind wanted to stop. The voices made it impossible to think of anything else. It was a sonic cage, one you couldn't break, one you weren't meant to escape. But there was another purpose to all this noise, one that was as practical as it was spiritual. It muffled you. In some cultures, there was a firm belief that the victim's cries, whether from fear, pain, or something in between, shouldn't disrupt the sanctity of the rite. Drums and chants could swallow those sounds before they reached the crowd, before they could plant doubt in the minds of witnesses. And still, the sound wasn't just for the living. Every note, every breath in those chants was aimed upward, outward, toward whatever divine presence they believed hovered over the scene. It was both an invitation and a command. Attend this moment, accept this gift. The truth is, the music didn't stop for you. It didn't even slow. It would play on, steady and impersonal, whether you hesitated or went willingly, whether you stumbled or walked with grace, because the next moment was inevitably, and the instruments were only there to escort you to it. And that moment was never left vague. You'd always known exactly how it was going to happen. If you'd been clinging to even a thin hope that the end might be gentle, this was where that thread snapped. There was nothing improvisational about how it would happen. Every movement had been practiced, every tool prepared, every outcome decided, long before you arrived. The method was never arbitrary. It was matched to the god, the place, the reason for the offering, and sometimes even to the season. In the great temples of central Mexico, the most iconic form was heart extraction. You'd be laid or held on a stone, Tecatl smooth, sloped, and positioned so your chest was just right for the priest standing above you. His blade, often obsidian, was sharper than steel but also fragile, meaning it cut clean but could shatter if mishandled. The cut was quick, the reach inside, not so much. The heart, still beating, was raised to the sun or the god's effigy, its steam mingling with the incense already thick in the air. Farther south, in certain plazas, decapitation was preferred. A single stroke with a flint-edged weapon could remove the head, which was then displayed or offered separately. In some cases, the body would be allowed to tumble down temple steps, the motion itself a symbolic act, blood feeding each level of the sacred structure as it fell. In the high-altitude shrines of the Andes, the approach was quieter, almost intimate. Death might come from a swift blow to the head, a tightening cord around the neck, or perhaps most hauntingly being buried alive in the frozen earth. The cold would take you quickly, but not instantly, and your final breath would be drawn into air so thin it could barely hold it. The preservation was part of the point. Your body would remain intact, eternally bound to that place. Other regions used fire not as an afterthought, but as the main event. In some coastal North African rites, recorded by ancient writers, the chosen might be placed on or within a blazing structure as an offering to a deity demanding heat and smoke. Whether those accounts are exaggerated or not, the idea that flame purified the sacrifice is consistent across multiple traditions. And still others chose drowning, the deliberate submersion in sacred waters, whether a river, a cenote, or the open sea. Water was both a passage and a barrier, delivering the offering to the gods below while sealing the moment from the living world. Every method had its own choreography, its own set of meanings understood by the community. But for you, the significance was less poetic. You'd have been watching the tools arrive, one by one, carried with the care of relics, set down in places chosen by ritual long before you were born. You might have known the exact moment, too, not because anyone told you, but because the tone of the chanting shifted, the drumbeat tightened, the air itself seemed to lean in. And then there was no more waiting, only the action, the offering, the end. But ending life wasn't the end of the ritual, not even close. What came after mattered just as much, and in some ways it could be stranger still. To you, it might have been a killing. To them, it was maintenance. The whole thing, your selection, your preparation. Your final moment fit neatly into a cosmic equation older than the walls around you. Blood wasn't just blood. It was currency, fuel, and communication all at once. In their view, without it, the machinery of the universe would start to seize. Crops would fail, rivers would shrink, enemies would advance, the sun might hesitate at the horizon. In the city-states of central Mexico, the explanation was brutally straightforward. The gods had bled themselves dry to create the world, and now it was your turn to pay the interest. The sun, in particular, was greedy. a force that needed a constant transfusion of human life to keep climbing into the sky each morning. Without offerings, it wouldn't just dim, it might stop altogether. That was the level of cosmic insecurity you were up against. In the stone cities further south, the offering was a negotiation. Life force was precious, and yours could be directed, sent to a rain deity, to end drought, to an underworld lord, to calm restless spirits, to a war god, to tilt the battlefield. The body was the letter, the blood was the ink. Without both, the message wouldn't arrive. On the far side of the world, in island societies where land and ocean blurred, sacrifice could be framed as a way to bind the human community to the forces that made the tides, the winds, and the fertility of the land. Life offered meant balance restored, storms diverted, or ancestral favor renewed. In Highland rituals, the gift of a life was said to link the people to the sacred peaks themselves, immense beings, whose moods decided whether the valleys would prosper or starve. And in all of these places, the logic wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't symbolic in the soft, modern sense. The act was believed to physically change reality. Your heart beating in the priest's hands wasn't just theater, it was a direct transfer of vitality to a god who would, in turn, use it to adjust the world in your people's favor. From where you stood or lay, that logic might have been hard to absorb. You could feel the eyes on you, not as judgment, but as expectation, the way someone looks at a gate that's about to open. You were the hinge between the human and the divine, and whether you believed in the cause or not, you couldn't escape the fact that everyone else did. That kind of belief has a weight to it, and in those last moments, it could feel heavier than the hands holding you down. But the act was never private. Belief doesn't feed itself, it needs witnesses. And for that, the next phase was essential. If the gods were the ones you were supposedly speaking to, the crowd was the one you were performing for. There was never any question of doing this quietly in some dim side chamber. The point was to be seen. A sacrifice wasn't just an offering, it was a civic event, a living reminder of the pact between the community and whatever forces loomed above or below them. When you emerged into that open space, it didn't matter whether it was a stepped temple plaza, a mountaintop clearing, or a stone platform by the sea. The geometry of the place was designed so everyone could see you. Elevated stairs, broad terraces, open courtyards, ancient architecture understood the value of a clear line. The people pressing in around the edges weren't there by accident. They were part of the machine. Their eyes completed the ritual. In the great urban centers, the space would be packed long before you arrived. Families came with children on their shoulders. Traders abandoned their stalls. Soldiers stood in formation, their armor catching the light. Even the very old made the effort to be there, leaning on canes carved decades earlier, their eyes still sharp for this kind of spectacle. No one wanted to be the person who missed the moment the gods were fed. The behavior of the crowd varied from place to place. In some cultures, it was solemn, the air so still you could hear the smallest rattle of beads on your ceremonial costume. In others, it was loud, almost festive, the chants and cheers blurring the line between celebration and bloodlust. Either way, you weren't walking into anonymity. Every movement you made was absorbed, processed, and stored in the collective memory of the people watching. This wasn't about morbid curiosity, it was about participation. Witnessing the act bound each person there into the bargain being struck. They didn't just hear that someone had been given to the gods, they saw it, smelled it, felt it in the vibration of the drums. They became part of the proof that the ritual had been done correctly, that the pact was unbroken. If the rains came or the armies won, they could say, yes, we were there when it was secured, and there was a subtle enforcement in this too. The presence of so many witnesses meant the officiants couldn't skip a step, couldn't cut corners. The crowd knew the sequence of events, knew the prayers, knew where the blood should flow. Their approval wasn't a formality, it was an unspoken audit. A badly executed ritual risked not just divine displeasure but human outrage. For you, being in the center of that gaze was a strange double-edged thing. On one hand, the sheer number of people could make you feel less alone, a final immersion in the community you'd been part of. On the other, it sharpened the reality that you were crossing a line no one else in that plaza was crossing today. You could feel their focus on your body, on your breath, on your still living heart, knowing they were measuring the moment they'd later tell their grandchildren about. And when the act was done, they wouldn't turn away immediately. They would watch what happened next, because in many places, what happened to your body afterward mattered just as much as what had just been taken from it. Death didn't close the curtain, it just changed the scene. Once your breath stopped, the body you left behind became a kind of sacred object, and what happened next was as choreographed as the killing itself. The offering wasn't over until every part of you had been placed, dressed, burned, buried, or displayed exactly where it was meant to go. In some temple complexes, the body remained where it fell only for the heartbeat of a moment, long enough for the officiants to mark the transition from living to offered. Then came the disassembly, sometimes literal. In central Mexican rites, your head might be taken to a tzampantli, a skull rack that stood in public view, each wooden stake holding the memory of past ceremonies. Your limbs could be ritually buried at the corners of a platform or left in sacred fields to feed the soil. None of this was random. Each placement told a piece of the cosmic story. High in the cold peaks, the treatment was different. Bodies were prepared for permanence, positioned in stone niches with offerings around them, woven textiles, carved figurines, small bowls of food or drink. The idea wasn't to hide you, but to preserve you as an eternal inhabitant of that place. You weren't just sacrificed to the gods of the mountain, you were installed in their court. In certain lowland cities, parts of the body could be consumed ceremonially. This wasn't common everywhere, but where it occurred, it was framed as absorbing the power of the offering, binding the community even more tightly to the act. Elsewhere, the remains were burned, the smoke carrying what was left of you upward toward the gods. The ash might then be scattered in sacred waters, ensuring the elements took their share. Sometimes the treatment was purely symbolic, sometimes it was tactile and unflinching. In island societies where the sea was a living deity, bones could be placed in specially constructed shrines on the shore, visited and tended long after the rest of the remains were gone. These were not graves in the modern sense, they were extensions of the temple system, still part of the religious infrastructure. For the community, this post-mortem handling had a practical side too. It proved the ritual had been completed in full, that nothing had been left half-finished. A sacrifice half-executed was worse than no sacrifice at all. It risked angering the gods, not pleasing them, which meant that every gesture, every transfer of the body, every scattering of ash or positioning of bones was done in deliberate order, in full view of the witnesses allowed to see it. And then there were the offerings placed with you. These weren't random trinkets, they were coded messages. Shells for the underworld, feathers for the sky, maize for sustenance, obsidian blades for protection. They weren't for you anymore. They were for the journey your life was now supposed to fuel. But once the body was settled, and the altar cleared, the meaning of your death didn't just dissolve into the air. It stayed in circulation, retold and reinforced, sometimes for political ends that had nothing to do with the gods at all. If you thought your death was purely a private arrangement between the gods and the community, you underestimated how much politics loves a good stage. In almost every society that practiced it, human sacrifice was as much about earthly power as it was about cosmic balance. And once your blood was spilled, it didn't just soak into the altar, it soaked into the narrative. Rulers understood that nothing asserted authority quite like deciding who lived and who died in the name of the divine. A public offering wasn't just a spiritual act, it was a broadcast. Every drop of blood was a headline that said, "This leader holds the keys to the gods themselves." When entire plazas filled to watch you die, they weren't just witnessing a religious obligation, they were being reminded, very directly, who was capable of orchestrating such a thing. After a military victory, the practice took on an even sharper edge. Captives from enemy armies were often offered up in prominent ceremonies. Their deaths turned into a warning to anyone considering defiance. This wasn't subtle messaging, it was a living press release carved into the memory of every witness. For weeks afterward, traders and travelers would carry the story of what they saw to neighboring cities, and with it, the quiet knowledge that rebellion had consequences measured in heartbeats. Even in non-military contexts, sacrifice could smooth the edges of political tension. A poor harvest, blame an imbalance in the relationship with the gods, and prove your leadership by restoring it with an offering. A bad omen in the skies, reassure the people by giving the heavens exactly what they supposedly demanded. In doing so, a ruler could frame themselves as both servant and master of the divine order, obedient enough to follow cosmic rules, powerful enough to choose the offering. It also worked inward, not just outward. Within the ruling class, Orchestrating or presiding over a sacrifice was a way to secure loyalty. Priests, nobles, military leaders, they all played their parts, each role reinforcing the hierarchy. Those chosen to assist in the ritual were elevated in status. Those excluded were reminded of their place. Your death, in this sense, was a piece of political currency, traded among the powerful to strengthen alliances or sideline rivals. And the symbolism didn't fade after the moment. Cords, whether carved into stone, painted on codices, or passed down orally, would carry the memory of the act, embedding it into the official history of a reign. Years later, a ruler could point to that time the gods were appeased as proof of their worthiness, even if the truth was that the offering had less to do with divine favor and more to do with consolidating power at home. But while politics could amplify the meaning of your death, it could also soften the consequences for those closest to you, at least on paper. Families of the sacrificed might be rewarded with land, goods, or titles. Publicly, this looked like generosity. Privately, it was more like paying off a debt before it became resentment. And for your family, that exchange would be the beginning of its own complicated chapter one, in which grief, status, and survival became tangled in ways only they had to live with for the people you left behind. The ritual didn't end when the drums stopped. In fact, in some ways, it didn't end at all. They had to live in the long shadow of your absence, which was rarely just personal grief, was social, political, and sometimes even economic. Outwardly, there was a script. They were expected to stand tall, to say the right things, to frame your death as an honor rather than a loss. Public mourning had rules. Cry too much, and it could look like doubt in the god's wisdom. Cry too little, and it might seem like you didn't care at all. Either way, people would talk, and people talking could lead to whispers in the wrong ears. In some places, the family was compensated. Land, animals, fine textiles, or special privileges, these could be handed over as a gesture of thanks. In the mountain regions, certain lineages who gave children to sacred ceremonies were remembered as spiritually distinguished, even invited to more elite social circles. It was prestige, yes, but prestige built on absence. You couldn't spend it at the dinner table. For poorer families, the rewards could be practical. Grain, tools, or livestock might mean survival through the next lean season. But these gifts were never free. They came with an unspoken expectation, loyalty to the system that had just taken your son, daughter, or sibling. Rejecting that loyalty could put you in the same danger you'd just watched someone you loved endure. There were other complications. In some traditions, the family became part of the ongoing ritual cycle, expected to attend ceremonies marking the anniversary of your death, to maintain offerings at your burial site, to carry your story for generations. This could be a source of pride, or a chain that kept them bound to the temple's influence long after the first sacrifice. Socially, it was a double-edged mark. On one side, people might treat them with deference, even awe. On the other, some might avoid them, as if death were contagious, or as if the god's attention once fixed on the household might linger a little too long. Marriage prospects could shift, alliances could change, and a family's standing in the community could quietly rise or fall, depending on how the sacrifice was remembered. And then there was the private reality, the one that didn't make it into the public ceremonies. An empty sleeping mat, an unfinished weaving, the sound of a voice you kept catching in your mind, only to remember it was gone. You might walk past the marketplace and see the stall where they used to stop, or climb the same mountain path they once took with you, and realize the place itself had changed because they were no longer in it. This is the part the ritual didn't care about. The gods, the priests, the rulers, they all moved on to the next ceremony, the next offering. But for the family, the sacrifice became a constant presence, a silent guest at every meal and every gathering. And sometimes, that presence was kept alive, not just in memory, but in the physical form of what had been left behind. Because in some cases, the dead didn't go far at all. They stayed right there, elevated, displayed, and impossible to forget. Centuries later, the earth still remembers. Sometimes it keeps you intact, as if it never quite agreed with the priest's plan to hand you over. Archaeologists have stumbled upon bodies so well preserved that the color of your hair, the weave of your clothing, even the last meal in your stomach is still there, stubbornly refusing to disappear. In the high mountains, the cold worked like a meticulous archivist, freezing every thread of your ceremonial textiles, every bead, every feather. you'd still be seated the way they left, Eunice drawn up, head bowed, not sleeping, but caught in a perpetual pause between offering and afterlife. The figurines, shell ornaments, and woven belts laid around you, still exactly where hands placed them hundreds of years before. These finds are so precise that scientists can tell if you'd been chewing coca leaves to ease the climb, or drinking a last dose of ritual beer before the cold claimed you. In the lowlands, where the earth is softer and the air heavier, water-filled pits and sinkholes have held onto offerings like time capsules. Skeletons lie alongside jade beads, obsidian blades, and pottery painted with scenes that explain, in their own language, what your role was. The minerals in the water coat bone in a slow embrace, making sure your story doesn't completely dissolve. On the stone platforms of abandoned temples, traces remain too, carvings showing the exact posture in which victims were presented. Painted murals frozen mid-ritual, and altar surfaces stained darker where years of offerings left their mark. Even the wear on temple stairs tells the story, those grooves and smooth patches formed by thousands of feet walking the same path you did, again and again. And then there are the artifacts that speak without words. Skull racks reconstructed from scattered bone, ritual knives still sharp enough to split a strand of hair, conch shells whose mouths are worn from years of summoning the same gods. These aren't just relics, they're receipts, proof that the pact between humans and the divine wasn't theoretical. It was acted out, over and over, with real bodies in real spaces. For the modern world, this is where the irony sets in. You might have been chosen for your beauty, your purity, your connection to the gods, but centuries later, your body is studied under fluorescent lights, your ornaments catalogued in climate-controlled drawers. Schoolchildren shuffle past your case in a museum, sticky-fingered and distracted, while a tour guide casually explains how you were ritually offered. Your death, once the pinnacle of sacred duty, becomes a line in a guidebook or a backdrop for a tourist selfie. And yet, the survival of your remains, your bones, your clothes, the objects you carried means the ritual worked in an unexpected way. You didn't just vanish into the hands of the gods. You lodged yourself in history's teeth. The archaeologists can read the weave of your tunic, the striations in your hair, the pollen trapped in your lungs. They can reconstruct the season you died, the weather that day, even the long walk you took to get there. In the end, the gods may have taken what they were owed, but the earth kept its copy. And whether your offering was meant to save crops, end drought, or crown a ruler's glory, your body still whispers the truth of what it costs, long after the temples fell silent. It rarely began with a knife. That part, sharp and final, came much later. First came the choosing, the quiet moment when a human life shifted from ordinary flesh to ceremonial currency. In many societies, selection was less about who deserved the honor and more about who fit the criteria of divine preference. Youth was prized, skin unlined by labor, bones still in their prime, the kind of physical symmetry that could be read as cosmic approval. In the highlands, boys and girls with straight spines and clear eyes were paraded before priestly councils, judged as much for their gait as for their genealogies. Purity, of course, was a negotiable concept. In some places, it meant virginity. In others, it meant a particular diet, or the absence of physical scars, or the misfortune of being born under a certain constellation. And sometimes, it was simply a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, like when a drought dragged on too long and the community began looking at the children of the wealthier families with a kind of softened envy. Sacrificing the son or daughter of a leader was not just a religious gesture, it was a public announcement that no one, not even the elite, stood above the gods. Divination sealed the decision. Priests knelt over bowls of water, watching the way flowers floated and shifted, or they fed maize kernels to birds, interpreting every flutter as a sign. A crack in a turtle shell, the direction a lizard ran when startled, the pattern of blood dripped onto sacred stonini. Of these could be taken as the voice of the divine naming a victim. The process wasn't quick. Days could pass, the suspense settling over the village like a humid fog, until the final verdict was spoken in a voice that pretended to be impartial. To outsiders, the chosen might have looked like the lucky ones draped in fine clothing, walked to the temple with garlands in their hair, blessed at every turn. But beneath the ceremony lay an unspoken truth. This elevation was terminal. The body was no longer theirs. It belonged to the ritual. Every smile they received was tinged with farewell. Every gift was a prelude to loss. Once their role was fixed, the transformation began. Daily life dissolved. The routines of family, work, and play were replaced by the slow machinery of preparation, rules, restrictions, and rites designed to strip away ordinary identity. And the first act in that transformation was removal, a physical and symbolic distancing that began the moment the gods or their human interpreters had made their choice. The first thing taken was not the life itself, but the surroundings. A chosen victim was rarely left among their people for long. Isolation had its own sacred logic. It kept the offering pure, or at least untainted by the unpredictable contact of daily life. In reality, it also removed the possibility of escape, or persuasion. Rituals were easier to complete. When the subject was kept somewhere, the exits were few and the guards were devout. In some traditions, this meant a move into the heart of the temple complex, behind walls painted with scenes of past offerings. The air there was heavy with incense and old prayers, the kind of stillness that made ordinary time feel irrelevant. Other cultures preferred natural enclosures, cave mouth barred with woven reed mats, a hut at the edge of the settlement, a house built just for the keeping of those awaiting their role. Family visits, if allowed at all, were brief and formal. Words were monitored, touch was rare. What passed between them was not conversation but ritual blessings repeated, gifts exchanged, songs sung that belonged more to the ceremony than to private affection. Sometimes the isolation lasted days, sometimes months, long enough for the rhythms of ordinary life to fade and for the victim to become part of the temple's daily cycle, an object of tending and watching. Practical needs were met, but comfort was not the point. Sleeping mats were thin. Meals were deliberate, sometimes generous, sometimes reduced to symbolic portions. Silence was encouraged, and in certain traditions, absolute. The idea was not simply to remove someone from their community, but to begin the work of unmaking them as a person. Without conversation, without shared labor, without the small distractions of normal life, the victim's world narrowed to the immediate and the ceremonial. Priests and attendants moved in and out, adjusting clothing, applying scented oils, chanting in low voices. Each act was part of the same slow erosion, stripping away the everyday, until what remained was a body positioned for the rite. And as the days wore on, isolation became less about physical confinement and more about reshaping the mind. By the time the next stage began, the chosen were no longer villagers or kin, they were offerings in the making, set apart in every possible way. Once the walls had closed in, the food began to vanish. Not all at once, no. That would have been too crude, too obvious. Instead, it was a steady reworking of what eating meant, a careful recalibration of the body until hunger became less of an inconvenience and more of a permanent companion. In many traditions, the first stage of the diet change wasn't starvation, but substitution. The everyday foods of the victim's life, grains, meat, the vegetables from the family plot, were replaced by dishes prepared with ritual intent. These could be fine, almost luxurious. At the beginning, sweetened maize cakes, roasted seeds, honey stirred into warm water. But there was always a catch. Each meal was symbolic, portioned more for spiritual effect than physical nourishment. The stomach was rarely filled. It was managed. As the days or weeks advanced, the substitutions grew stranger. Some cultures introduced sacred plants with mild psychoactive properties, just enough to fog the mind, loosen the tongue for prayers, or make the body feel unsteady. Others imposed strict bans on salt or fat, stripping the diet of anything that gave food a sense of satisfaction. And for certain offerings, there was the deliberate inclusion of bitter herbs or gritty flowers, the kind that turned every bite into a reminder that the meal was not meant for enjoyment. Fasting proper began when the priests judged the body ready to be thinned. This was never described as weakening, at least not publicly. It was framed as purification, the removal of earthly heaviness so the spirit could rise more easily to its destination. In the highlands, where the air was already thin, days without solid food could send the chosen into light-headed states that were reinterpreted as visions. By the rivers and coasts, fasting was paired with constant bathing or sweating in steam huts, until the victim's limbs trembled from more than just hunger. Some societies reserved their strictest fasts for the final stretch. In these last days, the meals might be a mouthful of water scented with flowers, or a pinch of ground maize barely moistened on the tongue. The goal was not simply to drain strength, but to cultivate an appearance: cheekbones sharpened, eyes deepened, skin stretched taut so that the ceremonial paint would cling perfectly. A body brought to this state was not seen as suffering but as refined, like a vessel shaped and fired before being placed on the altar. And yet, even in this refinement, there was calculation. A victim too weak to walk the ceremonial route would rob the rite of its grandeur. The fasting had to be just enough to create the sacred image without breaking the body before its appointed time. It was a balance the priests had learned to keep with precision, one more skill in the long tradition of preparing a person to be more than a person. From here, the work would shift outward again. What the body had lost in flesh, it would now gain in marks and colors that declared it ready. By the time food had been reduced to a polite suggestion, the body was ready for its next transformation. This stage was less about what went in, and more about what was done to the outside, a process that turned skin, hair, and bone into a proclamation for the gods. If fasting had hollowed the vessel, physical alteration decorated it, each touch a declaration that this was no longer just a human form but a sacred object in motion. In some traditions, the work began with the head. Hair was cut in prescribed ways, sometimes completely shaved to signify rebirth, sometimes shaped into elaborate knots and braids meant to echo the iconography of deities. The hair itself could become part of the ritual, burned as incense, buried with offerings, or woven into cords that would later bind the victim's wrists. Other times, instead of removing it, attendants coated the hair with clay, oils, or mineral powders, creating stiff crowns that cracked as the head moved. The skin came next. In river valleys, bodies were bathed repeatedly in aromatic infusions of flowers, resins, or crushed leaves, leaving a thin, sticky film that both perfumed and preserved. Elsewhere, pigments made from ground minerals were applied in precise patterns: white for purity, red for vitality, black for death's embrace. These colors weren't random decoration. Each was tied to a theological script understood by everyone present. A single painted line across the forehead or down the chest was a wordless announcement of what role the victim would play in the great exchange between the human and the divine. Scarification and tattooing, though slower, were sometimes part of this stage. Patterns were cut into the skin with stone or obsidian, rubbed with ash or plant dyes so that the wounds healed as raised, darkened marks. To the victim, these were permanent, painful, and at this point irrelevant to a future they would not live to see. To the priests, they were proof that the offering had been claimed physically as well as spiritually. Clothing completed the presentation. Ordinary garments were set aside in favor of fabrics reserved for the sacred fine-woven cotton, embroidered animal hides, or layers of plant fiber softened by pounding and soaking. In some places, the victim was dressed in the likeness of the god or spirit they were meant to honor: a jaguar pelt, a headdress of bird feathers, a necklace strung with shells or carved bone. In others, the clothing was deliberately minimal, meant to display the painted skin and altered body like a canvas. The result was both beautiful and unsettling, a living work of art created with the knowledge that its exhibition would be brief. Every texture, every color, every cut into the skin was a sign that the transformation was nearly complete. The victim's reflection, if they were allowed to see it, would have been unrecognizable, a stranger who belonged to ceremony rather than to life. From here, the next stage would strip away not just fleshly comfort, but human impurity in its most symbolic forms. The body, now marked and dressed, had to be made clean in ways that went beyond soap and water. Cleanliness, in the context of a sacrifice, was never about hygiene in the modern sense. No one cared about removing dirt for the sake of avoiding disease. Purification was a symbolic act, one that scrubbed away not just sweat and soil, but the human associations that clung stubbornly to a body. It was an attempt to return the victim to a state that was both sacred and dangerously neutral, like a vessel emptied of everything but the role it was about to play. The process could begin with water, but not the kind drawn casually from a village well. It had to be sourced from a river regarded as a living being, or from springs that emerged in places already thick with myth. The bathing was often supervised, sometimes even conducted by the priests themselves, who poured the water slowly over the body, reciting verses meant to loosen any lingering impurities. In colder climates, steam huts were used instead. Low enclosed structures where heat and smoke pressed into the skin until sweat carried away the imagined residue of ordinary life. Herbal infusions played a central role. Bundles of aromatic plant scopal resin, crushed leaves of cleansing herbs, petals of flowers associated with renewal were added to the water or burned nearby so that their scent clung to the skin. The victim might be rubbed with coarse leaves, not only to exfoliate but to remind them that the act was not about comfort. In some cultures, clay or ash was smeared across the skin as part of the cleansing. Paradoxically, covering the body in earth was seen as the final step in making it ritually clean. Abstinence was another form of purification. For days or weeks before the offering, the victim might be forbidden to eat certain foods, speak certain words, or even make eye contact with particular people. In some traditions, sexual abstinence was enforced long before the final rites, not out of prudishness but because bodily desire was thought to dilute the potency of the offering. Even conversation could be restricted, the logic being that words carried traces of the mundane, and the chosen should speak only when their voices were being used for the ritual itself. Incense was a constant presence. Resin smoke was waved over the victim in deliberate motions, each pass of the smoke an invisible cloak. The smell worked its way into skin, hair, and clothing, so that by the end of the process, the person carried a scent more aligned with the temple than with the world outside. Bells, rattles, or conch shells might sound during the cleansing. Each note meant to break any unseen attachments between the victim and the ordinary life they had left behind. When it was over, the body felt lighter, not in the physical sense, but in the way a painted mask feels when it separates the wearer from themselves. This was the point, to create a clean slate, a being without contamination from daily living, ready to be shaped entirely by the next phase of the ritual. And the next phase would be less about removing and more about instilling, training the victim in the words, movements, and postures they would be expected to carry into their final performance. Once the body was cleansed and marked, the real work began, not the work of the priests, but of the offering itself. Being chosen was not just about lying down and letting the gods have their due. No, there was choreography to learn, words to memorize, gestures to perfect. The victim was not merely a body. They were part of a performance that had been rehearsed for generations, and the role came with expectations. Training began with posture. In many traditions, how one stood before the altar was as important as the sacrifice itself. Shoulders back, spine straight, chin lifted just enough to suggest readiness, but never arrogance. Knees might be kept slightly bent in deference, or locked in a rigid stance that made every muscle ache. Attendants corrected these details relentlessly, their hands pressing on backs, tilting heads, tugging arms into position. In some cultures, victims were expected to hold these postures for long stretches, training the body to endure without fidgeting because nothing spoiled a divine spectacle, like a chosen offering shifting uncomfortably before the crowd. The voice was next. If chants or prayers were to be recited, the tone had to be exact. Too low, and the words would vanish into the hum of the audience. Too high, and they risked sounding frantic. In some places, the victim's role was to sing not with emotion, but with the measured, almost hypnotic cadence of ritual music. In others, they had to speak lines written centuries earlier, memorizing each syllable as if a slip could ruin the offering entirely. Movement was drilled with the precision of a military exercise. Walking the ceremonial path was never as simple as placing one foot in front of the other. The steps had to match the beat of drums or the shake of rattles, often at a pace designed to be just slow enough to build tension. In certain rites, pauses were built in at key points, where the victim would stand still while priests circled them, muttering invocations or sprinkling powders onto their skin. Every stop, every turn, every bow was deliberate, a fragment of a story that the sacrifice was helping to tell. Even facial expressions were subject to control. A solemn face suggested dignity. A serene smile could be read as willing acceptance. Closed eyes might be seen as communion with the divine. Grimacing or weeping could ruin the moment, though some traditions tolerated tears as a sign of the offering's sincerity. Either way, the face had to match the myth being enacted. This training wasn't about empowering the victim. It was about ensuring that the ceremony unfolded without flaw, that the audience, whether a crowd of villagers or the gods themselves, saw exactly what they were meant to see. By the time the training was over, the chosen had been molded into an actor in the final scene of their own life, rehearsed down to the smallest gesture. and once the movements were perfect, there was still one more layer to apply: the careful construction of symbols and attire that would turn the victim into a walking embodiment of the sacred story. The clothing of a sacrificial victim was never random. Every fiber, every bead, every scrap of paint served a purpose beyond decoration. It was a portable myth, a living tableau for those who would watch the ceremony unfold. If the fasting and the training had stripped away individuality, the costume replaced it with a new identity, one designed not for survival, but for spectacle and meaning. The base layer was often the simplest part: a tunic of woven cotton, a skirt of plant fibers, or a hide softened until it draped like cloth. But the choice of material was deliberate. Cotton might signal a connection to the agricultural cycle, animal skins to the strength or qualities of the creature sacrificed alongside the human. In coastal regions, shells were sewn into hymns, so they clicked faintly as the wearer walked, each sound a reminder that they were moving toward an irreversible end. Above that came the symbols. Feathers were a common choice: brilliant macaw, plumes, or the iridescent greens and blues of forest birds, their colors carrying coded meanings about the god or element being honored. In some places, a victim might be dressed to resemble a deity outright, with headpieces shaped like animal heads, masks carved to mimic divine faces, or layered fabrics dyed in patterns that matched temple murals. Elsewhere, they might be made to represent the earth, the sky, or a season clothed in greens and browns for fertility, or in stark whites to signify the purity of snow or bone. Paint and ornamentation transformed exposed skin into part of the costume. Red ochre, charcoal, powdered lime, and plant dyes were applied in geometric or symbolic designs: spirals for eternity, zigzags for lightning, dots for seeds and rebirth. Jewelry wasn't for beauty, but for emphasis. A necklace of carved bone could suggest ancestral presence, a belt of woven grass, the binding of mortal to divine. Some costumes were intentionally heavy, forcing the victim to move slowly, turning each step into an effort. Others were so minimal they bordered on the naked. The lack of covering meant to emphasize the vulnerability of the offering. In both cases, the clothing dictated the rhythm of movement, making the victim's body part of the ceremonial tempo. Even the smallest accessory could carry weight. A single flower tucked behind the ear might be the species associated with death or mourning. A bracelet might be woven from the same reeds used to thatch the god's temple. Nothing was without purpose, and nothing was meant to survive beyond the ceremony. Most costumes were dismantled or burned immediately after the rite, their symbolism released along with the life they adorned. By the time the dressing was complete, the victim was no longer an individual. They had become a figure in a larger narrative, recognizable to everyone present, but only as a role. The audience would not see a neighbor or a relative. They would see a god's consort, a season embodied, or a cosmic bargain given human form. And once the identity was fixed in the eyes of the people, it was time to begin the long, deliberate unveiling. The processional route that would display the offering to every onlooker before the final moment arrived. The walk itself was a performance long before the blade ever touched skin. The processional route turned the victim into a moving altar, paraded through space so that every eye could witness the transformation they had already endured. It wasn't just about reaching the place of sacrifice, it was about staging the approach, stretching the final moments into something slow and unavoidable. The path was never arbitrary. In temple cities, it might wind through narrow streets lined with onlookers, the high walls echoing with the sound of drums, rattles, and conch shells. In rural settings, it could cut across open fields, a straight sun-baked track leading from the outskirts toward the ceremonial platform. In both cases, the route often passed by key landmarks, shrines, altars, sacred trees where short rituals or blessings would pause the march. Each stop reinforced the inevitability of the destination. Crowds were part of the design. Neighbors, relatives, and strangers stood pressed together, some offering flowers, others tossing grains or petals onto the path, still others simply staring. In some traditions, they were encouraged to shout blessings or sing verses. In others, complete silence was enforced, the only sound coming from the measured beat of ceremonial music. Either way, the air was thick with the awareness that everyone was there to see one thing, and one thing only. Attendants surrounded the victim not as guards, exactly, but as moving parts of the display. They might hold incense burners, scatter herbs underfoot, or carry the ritual tools that would be used at the end. In some processions, they walked in precise formation. In others, they moved more loosely, darting in to adjust a headdress or reapply paint where sweat or wind had worn it away. The pace was deliberate, almost punishing. Each step was matched to the beat of the drums or the cadence of chants, ensuring that the journey stretched far longer than it needed to. If the victim faltered, attendants would steady them without breaking the rhythm. The slowness was the point. It gave time for the community to absorb the sight, for the weight of the act to settle into the minds of all present. Objects and symbols lined the path. Torches flared even in daylight, marking the way. Offerings of food, cloth, or carved figurines were laid at intervals, some to be collected later, others left to decay as part of the ritual. In certain places, the ground itself was altered for the occasion, strewn with flower petals, covered with woven mats, or dusted with colored powders that created patterns underfoot. By the time the procession reached its destination, the victim had been on display for what could feel like an eternity. Every sight, sound, and scent of the walk was calculated to prepare both the offering and the onlookers for what came next. And what came next was the final stage of prelude: the positioning, binding, and alignment that would fix the victim in place for the last act. The destination was never just where the sacrifice happened. It was a stage set for a specific arrangement of flesh, bone, and symbolism. Once the procession ended, the victim wasn't simply left to stand there. They were placed, oriented, and more often than not secured, until every limb matched the blueprint of the rite. In some traditions, positioning meant standing upright before an altar, hands raised or folded, the body forming a living column. In others, it meant kneeling on woven mats, forehead lowered, a posture of submission that strained the spine after only a few minutes. Where the act was meant to involve public spectacle, the victim might be elevated on a platform so that even the farthest onlooker could see the final moment without obstruction. Restraint was a practical matter, but it was also part of the symbolism. Binding the wrists and ankles with cords of plant fiber, leather thongs, or braided hair sent a clear message: the offering belonged to the gods now, and to no one else. Sometimes the bindings were decorative, dyed in bright colors, adorned with shells or feathers, so that even the act of restraint appeared ceremonial rather than merely functional. In other settings, they were brutally utilitarian, leaving marks that would outlast the ceremony itself. Positioning also served the needs of the ritual specialists. If the offering required blood to be caught in a vessel, the body had to be angled so the flow was clean and uninterrupted. If the rite involved dismemberment or removal of the heart, the victim's torso needed to be accessible without shifting them mid-act. Precision mattered. Every movement after this point had to be smooth, practiced, and free from the clumsy adjustments that might break the ritual's flow. The act of securing the victim was rarely silent. Chants rose and fell around them, accompanied by the steady beat of drums or the rattle of seed pods. Incense smoke curled upward, blurring the line between the living and the divine. Attendants moved in close, adjusting a rope here, shifting a foot there, tilting the head so the face was turned toward the audience or toward the sky. In some cultures, the victim's gaze was deliberately directed toward a specific point: the temple's inner sanctum, the rising sun, or even the face of the officiating priest. By now, the body was more an object than a person, an axis around which the rest of the ritual revolved. It was fixed, contained, and stripped of the ability to interrupt what would follow. And with the body locked into position, the next step could begin. The final invocations, the concentrated flood of words, music, and offerings meant to call the gods to watch what was about to unfold. Once the body was fixed in place, the air thickened. Everything that came before the fasting, the isolation, the training, the procession had been a slow tightening of the rope, and now the knot was about to cinch. This was the point where the living world made its last, formal appeal to the unseen. As if to say, "We've brought you the offering, we've dressed it, we've prepared it, now come and take it." The invocations were not casual prayer. They were recited in the exact words, cadence, and sequence that had been preserved for generations. A syllable out of place could be considered disastrous, not just for the sacrifice but for the community's relationship with its gods. The officiants, priests, shamans, or elders spoke in voices trained to carry over wind and distance, their tones layered with rhythm so hypnotic it bordered on musical. In some cultures, the chants were accompanied by drumming so deep and steady it felt like the ground itself was breathing in time with the ritual. Offerings surrounded the scene. Bowls of grain, baskets of fruit, flasks of fermented drink, even live animals waited at the edges of the ceremonial space. In some places, these were given before the human act, as if sweetening the request. In others, they were held back, to be placed alongside the body immediately after. Every object had a role: smoke to carry the prayer upward, food to feed the spirits, liquids to cleanse or consecrate the space. This was also the moment when the wider community participated most directly. The crowd might join in a repeated refrain, hum under their breath, or sway with the music. In certain traditions, everyone present was expected to make a physical gesture, lifting hands to the sky, touching the earth, or placing a hand over the heart. Even the youngest members of the audience were drawn into the act, learning by doing what it meant to send someone away to the gods. Sometimes the invocations were addressed directly to the forces being honored, naming deities, ancestors, or elemental powers. Other times, they were spoken as if to the victim, acknowledging their role and urging them to carry the community's needs into the divine realm. Words might speak of journeys, of transformation, of passing from one state to another, reinforcing the idea that this was not merely an ending but a transition. The sensory overload was deliberate. The smell of burning resins and herbs mingled with the tang of sweat and blood already anticipated. The repetitive chant and drumbeats worked their way into the body's pulse. The flicker of torches or sunlight off polished ornaments gave the scene an otherworldly shimmer. When the last invocation faded, the silence that followed was as heavy as the sound had been. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath, the space between readiness and action. And in that space, the officiants made their final adjustments, ensuring the tools were within reach, the angle was correct, and nothing, absolutely nothing, could interrupt the act about to come. It always ended here, at the point where the body was no longer its own and the air felt charged enough to split. Everything before had been dismantling work, peeling away the human layer by layer until only the role remained. The fasting had hollowed, the isolation had softened, the costuming had remade, the procession had displayed, the bindings had fixed, and the invocations sealed it all beneath a weight of words older than memory. By the time the first movement of the blade, stone, or staff came, the body was already a vessel emptied of personal claim. The blade was only the punctuation. The sentence had been written long before, and in that last moment before the cut, the victim stood ornamented, restrained, and surrounded at the narrowest point between the living and whatever waited beyond. The preparations had done their work. The rest was inevitable. The first plate placed before the chosen was never just a meal. It was a message written in grain and flesh, a kind of edible contract between the living body and the unseen forces waiting for it. In many places, that final diet was curated with a precision most modern chefs would envy, though. Of course, the purpose was less about flavor and more about symbolism. In the highlands of the Andes, maize was steamed, ground, and shaped into soft, pale loaves, sometimes sweetened with honey or chicha syrup. This wasn't casual starch. Maize was the crop of cosmic order, grown with the same rituals that marked the seasons, and eating it in such a moment was to step into a role older than any single life. Far from those mountains, in temple complexes along the Mediterranean coast, honey and milk appeared as the inevitable pairing. Honey, the immortal food, incorruptible, even in the dampness of tombs, slid down the throat alongside milk. The primal sustenance. Together, they sent the body toward death wrapped in sweetness, perhaps to make it palatable to the gods, or, more cynically, to disguise the bitterness of what was coming. In parts of West Africa, the menu might have included carefully roasted game meat, chosen for its symbolic association with strength or nobility. Each bite wasn't simply consumed, it was absorbed as part of the role the victim now embodied. These foods were rarely improvised. They belonged to a cycle in which agricultural, hunting, and animal husbandry practices were inseparable from religion. That loaf of maize was the product of fields sown with offerings. That honey came from hives, tended with chants. That meat was taken from an animal selected under the eye of a diviner. The chosen body became the last link in a chain of sacred transactions, swallowing what had itself been raised, harvested, or hunted in a ritual framework. Yet the ritual diet was also a kind of transformation in disguise. It marked a departure from the victim's everyday meals, which might have been rough, sparse, and unadorned. Here, suddenly, came the concentrated symbols of plenty. In a paradox that anthropology never tires of pointing out, those destined for death often ate better in their last days than in all the days before. The plate before them was not a mercy, but a coronation of sorts. The final proof that they had been lifted, if only temporarily, out of ordinary human life. And then there were the small but telling restrictions. In some traditions, certain foods were omitted entirely, not because they were scarce, but because they belonged to the living. Salt, for instance, was sometimes withheld, as if to sever the victim's connection to the human community, leaving them bland to mortal taste, but seasoned for divine consumption. Other times, meat from domestic animals was avoided, replaced with wild-caught fare to symbolize departure from the hearth into the wilderness of the afterlife. Every morsel was a signal. A nut tucked into a loaf might represent fertility, a certain spice might invoke fire, a leaf garnish might echo the plants that grew in the land of the dead. The victim, whether they understood these codes or not, carried them into their body, becoming a vessel not only for their own life, but for a constellation of meanings that extended beyond it. And with the meal swallowed, the next step could begin, not the end of preparation, but its intensification, as the body that had been fed was about to be reshaped. The last feast was never just a dinner. It was theater, a public contract, a kind of slow-moving spectacle where everyone present understood that the star of the evening wouldn't be around to see tomorrow's sunrise. It happened in plazas, courtyards, temple precincts, or the open sweep of a village square. And it was designed to be signed because, what was the point of transforming a human being into a divine gift if no one bore witness? The seating mattered. In some places, the victim was placed on a raised platform or dais, the physical elevation signaling their temporary status as someone above the crowd, yet already belonging to the gods. In others, they were positioned at the head of a long communal table, so every conversation, every toast, every burst of laughter had to glance their way. They were a focal point, framed by food and eyes, the living reminder of what the gathering was about. Food arrived in abundance, but the abundance was carefully curated. In Mesoamerican temple complexes, maize tamales might be unwrapped from their steaming husks right beside bowls of cacao drink, so rich it clung to the lips. In ancient Mediterranean port cities, platters of figs, roasted lamb, and rounds of fresh bread were set alongside earthen jugs of wine, their rims already stained with purple from earlier pours. In some Andean highland communities, chicha beer brewed, thick and sweet, was ladled into clay cups and passed in sequence, ensuring that everyone shared in the same warmth, the same taste, the same preparation for the event to come. The victim didn't eat alone. They dined in full view of the people who had raised them, married them, competed with them, or barely known them at all. And the crowd didn't just watch, they participated. Some came forward to place morsels directly into the victim's hands or mouth, a gesture that was part blessing, part ownership. Others offered toasts or recited prayers, folding personal words into the larger ritual fabric. The presence of family could be tender or unbearably tense. In some traditions, kin were kept away entirely to prevent emotional disruptions, while in others, they were seated close, both as comforters and as witnesses who could not deny what had taken place. Music threaded through it all. Flutes, drums, stringed instruments, rattles, each lending a rhythm that wasn't for dancing so much as for marking time. The beat reminded everyone that this wasn't a festival in the ordinary sense. It was a procession in disguise, a forward movement toward a very specific conclusion. Dancers might circle the feast, weaving patterns that echoed the cosmological stories of the community stories in which sacrifice was the hinge between prosperity and disaster. It wasn't uncommon for the feast to serve as a space for storytelling. Elders recounted myths of past offerings, sometimes exaggerating details until the stories became as much about human drama as divine transaction. Children sat cross-legged at the edges, half bored, half fascinated, absorbing the lesson that this was how the world worked. Sometimes someone left so the rest could stay. And while the air was filled with the smell of roasting meats, fermenting drink, and wood smoke, there was another scent beneath it, a sharp awareness that this was a farewell disguised as celebration. The victim might smile, drink deeply, even joke, but the role they occupied was irreversible. Every laugh carried the faintest aftertaste of grief. By the end, when the last cup had been drained and the platter stood bare but for scraps, the community had done what it needed. It had seen, acknowledged, and taken part in the transformation. And with that, the feast dissolved into the next stage, not the end of hospitality, but the beginning of ritual control, as the same hands that had served the meal would now guide the chosen into the space where the body itself would be remade. If the last feast was abundance, fasting was the sudden withdrawal, deliberate and jarring shift designed to strip the body and mind of anything resembling normal rhythm. It wasn't just about skipping meals, it was about dismantling appetite itself. In many traditions, the days or even weeks before the final act was spent in controlled deprivation, reducing the body to something lean, emptied, and pliable. Hunger was the sculptor, and the victim was the clay. The rules varied. In some highland societies, fasting meant no solid food at all, only thin broths or herbal infusions that kept the body technically alive but progressively weaker. In certain temple systems of the ancient Near East, victims were restricted to tiny, symbolic portions, grains, measured by the pinch, sips of water rationed as though they were more precious than gold. Elsewhere, the restriction focused not on quantity, but on type. No salt, no spices, no meat, sometimes no cooked food at all. The diet narrowing until it felt less like eating and more like existing in a state of ritual pause. Fasting wasn't purely physical preparation, it was spiritual conditioning. In Andean high-altitude rituals, the weakness from hunger, combined with thin air, often produced lightheadedness, a sense of floating that priests interpreted as the body slipping between worlds. In Polynesian island traditions, prolonged food restriction was sometimes paired with night vigils, so that exhaustion layered itself over hunger until the victim's resistance dissolved into a receptive stillness. In parts of Africa, where fasting could stretch over entire moon cycles, the body became a visible testament to the offering, ribs emerging, cheeks hollowing, skin tightening over the jaw, until the face itself seemed carved for the occasion. There was symbolism, too, in the emptiness. An unfed body was seen as easier for the gods to inhabit, like a clean vessel waiting to be filled. Food, in this context, was not nourishment, but cluttered, too heavy, too rooted in earthly ties. By denying it, the victim became lighter, closer to the unseen, easier to carry away when the moment came. Yet fasting wasn't simply endured, it was managed. The process was watched over by priests, attendants, or designated guardians, ensuring that the victim didn't faint too soon, or worse, steal food. In some cases, small offerings were made directly to the mouth, but not swallowed. The taste of sacred ingredients allowed to dissolve on the tongue before being spat out, as if feeding the gods through the intermediary of the chosen. This careful policing of hunger reinforced the fact that the body no longer belonged to itself. The psychological effects were just as important. Prolonged hunger blurred the line between wakefulness and dream, pulling the mind into places it might not have gone on a full stomach. Hallucinations weren't rare visions of ancestors, animals, or deities appearing in the haze of weakness. Whether these were divine visitations or the brain's way of waving a white flag was irrelevant. Both interpretations served the ritual's purpose. By the end of the fast, the victim's movements were slower, their speech quieter, their bodies stripped of the casual gestures that come with strength. The transformation was visible to everyone. This was no longer the same person who had sat at the feast, laughing with the crowd. This was a being in transition, hovering somewhere between the human and the offering, ready for the next stage when the body, already weakened, would be altered, not just by hunger but by substances meant to push it further from the realm of the living. If fasting hollowed the body out, intoxicating drinks flooded it with something entirely different or warm. Heavy current meant to loosen the grip of fear and tighten the hold of ritual. These weren't casual cups passed around for merriment. They were measured doses of transformation, as precise in purpose as any priest's chant or sacrificial blade. In the valleys of ancient Mesoamerica, cacao drinks were a frequent choice, thick, bitter, frothed with maize, and spiced with chili or fragrant flowers. This wasn't the sweetened comfort modern tongues expect. It was a jolting, almost medicinal brew, capable of quickening the heart and sharpening sensation. In certain Andean ceremonies, chica beer fermented from maize until it reached a cloudy, sour potency was ladled into clay vessels so large they seemed impossible to lift. The drink wasn't meant to be sipped. It was meant to be swallowed in long, slow draughts, until the world felt both heavier and more distant. Some rituals preferred the numbing rather than the energizing. In parts of Southeast Asia, palm wine laced with plant resins dulled the senses and slowed the body's reactions, making resistance unlikely. In the Mediterranean, herbal wines infused with opium poppy or henbane could induce a strange, drifting stature cross between intoxication and sedation, where the body remained upright but the mind was already elsewhere. Far from random, these recipes were guarded by specialists who knew the exact ratios needed to carry someone to the threshold without pushing them across it too soon. The serving itself was ceremonial. Vessels were carved, painted, or incised with symbols of gods, animals, or cosmological patterns, so that every sip brought the drinker's mouth into contact with a surface charged with meaning. Sometimes the cup was placed directly into the victim's hands, a final act of agency before it was taken away. Sometimes it was held by an attendant, who tilted it toward the lips like feeding a child. The act was as much about the gesture as the liquid itself. Intoxication wasn't just indulgence, it was a ritual condition. In the eyes of the officiants, a body flooded with sacred drink was more permeable to divine influence. The warmth in the veins, the sway in the step, the blurring of sight and sound, these were signs that the human frame was becoming receptive, pliable, fit for the passage ahead. In some Amazonian traditions, for instance, ritual drinks blended fermented fruit with hallucinogenic plants, producing visions that priests interpreted as the victim's first steps into the spirit world. There was also the social dimension. To drink in public, under the gaze of the community, was to signal acceptance of what was coming. Each gulp became a visible milestone, a silent acknowledgement that the boundary between before and after was thinning. In some ceremonies, the crowd joined in, sharing a weaker version of the same drink, creating a collective intoxication that blurred the line between those who would stay and the one who would go. By the time the vessel was drained, the victim's body carried two opposing forces, the weakness of fasting and the weight of intoxication. Muscles loosened, movements slowed, thoughts wandered. The air seemed thicker, the light softer, the sounds more distant. It was the perfect state for what came next, when the body, already weakened and warmed, would be wrapped, painted, and costumed until it no longer resembled the person it had once been. After the fast and the drink came the strange, deliberate reintroduction of food not as nourishment, but as coded language the body was forced to speak. The plates brought forward in this stage weren't designed to fill the stomach. They were meant to inscribe meaning onto the flesh. Every bite, every forbidden morsel was a word in the sentence of the offering. In some ancient Anatolian rites, tiny cakes shaped like animals or celestial symbols were pressed into the hands of the victim, their patterns leaving faint imprints on the skin. Eating them was more than taste, it was swallowing the likeness of the deity or force they represented, absorbing its essence in preparation for the final act. In highland Andean communities, guinea pig meat served for important occasions was sometimes roasted and offered to the chosen, not for indulgence but as a seal of their elevated and doomed status. Other foods were intentionally transgressive. In parts of Polynesia, victims were sometimes fed delicacies forbidden to the wider community, like certain fish species or fatty cuts of pork. To eat what others could not was a sign that the victim had already crossed into another category of being. In the Mediterranean, this inversion could take the form of eating foods associated with the gods themselves, honey cakes, barley loaves drenched in oil while being watched by the very people forbidden to touch them on ordinary days. There were also offerings that tasted of ordeal. In the ritual systems of Mesoamerican cities, bitter or spicy elements were often added in such concentration that the experience was more trial than pleasure. Chili ground, so hot it burned the mouth. Cacao, so untempered by sweetness that it coated the tongue in acrid powder. In sub-Saharan African contexts, certain bitter herbs and roots were chewed, their juices staining the lips and teeth, a visible mark of participation in the final preparation. Some foods were selected for their transformative properties. Hallucinogenic seeds like morning glory or intoxicating mushrooms could be worked into sauces, breads, or stews, slipping psychoactive effects into what seemed like a simple meal. In the Amazon, roasted cassava might be mixed with crushed plant matter, known to induce visions, ensuring that the victim's final hours were accompanied by drifting shapes and distant voices no one else could hear. The way the food was presented mattered as much as its content. Platters might be carved with sacred symbols, or the portions arranged into geometric patterns reflecting the cosmology of the community. In some traditions, the food was offered in sequence, first the bitter, then the sweet, then the neutral, mimicking the life cycle from struggle to reward to stillness. In others, it was piled high and offered all at once, a sensory overload that blurred meaning into abundance. The forbidden foods carried a double edge. They elevated and they separated. By eating them, the victim confirmed their special status, but also reinforced the reality that there was no coming back. He didn't return to the ordinary table after dining on what was set apart for gods. When the plates were cleared, the effect was subtle but irreversible. The body had been marked from the inside, filled with flavors and substances that carried weight in the unseen world. And with the taste of the last bite still lingering on the tongue, the attendants moved in not to feed or serve, but to transform the surface itself, painting and clothing the figure until the person beneath began to vanish. The dressing came after the stomach had been dealt with once hunger, drink, and symbolic mouthfuls had worked their way into the body. Clothing wasn't just fabric. It was the final rewriting of identity in visible form. To dress the chosen was to erase their former self and replace it with a walking emblem of the god's will. In the river valleys of West Africa, cloth dyed in sacred colors, often reds, drawn from camwood powder, or yellows from turmeric and ochre, was wrapped around the body in elaborate folds. These weren't everyday shades. They were pigments reserved for thresholds, birth, initiation, burial. The effect was immediate. Skin and fabric together became a single, moving symbol. In Mesoamerican highlands, cotton tunics or cloaks might be embroidered with geometric patterns representing celestial bodies, rivers, or serpents, depending on which deity was being honored. The garments were sometimes so stiff with dye and starch that the figure wearing them moved like a statue. Adornment often involved more than cloth. Feathers were a favorite in tropical and subtropical regions, not randomly chosen, but selected for their association with specific animals and mythic qualities. A crown of macaw feathers was not just decoration. It was the living spectrum of the sky draped on a head that wouldn't see another sunrise. In Arctic and subarctic zones, fur from particular animals, polar bear, wolf, seal, was used to signal strength, transformation, or the protection of spirits during the passage. Metal had its place, too. In the Andes and Mediterranean alike, hammered gold or copper discs were suspended on the chest, clinking with each step, catching the light like little suns. Sometimes shells took their place, their curved surfaces carved with intricate symbols and worn as pendants or sewn into belts, each one a piece of the community's cosmological map. Jewelry might extend to nose ornaments, ear spools, or lip plugs, pieces that physically altered the silhouette of the face, making it less human and more archetype. Paint was perhaps the most intimate transformation. Across the Pacific Islands, bodies were coated in white clay or lime, erasing natural skin tone, creating the pallor of something no longer entirely alive. Elsewhere, red pigments, mixed from ground minerals or plants, were smeared across cheeks, arms, and chests, the color of life's blood worn boldly on the surface before it was spilled. In certain native North American ceremonies, black stripes or dots marked the victim's limbs, a signal to the spirit world that this was a prepared body, set apart from the living. The dressing was rarely silent. Attendants might chant, hum, or speak softly while fastening each piece, as though narrating the transformation in real time. The victim, meanwhile, was made to stand still for long stretches, on object to be worked on rather than an active participant. Each added layer, each painted line was another step away from the individual and toward the role. When it was finished, the figure before the crowd no longer belonged to the everyday world. They were draped in the language of the sacred every feather, bead, and smear of pigment, a syllable in the god's sentence. And as the first breeze caught the feathers or shifted the fabric, the attendants guided the transformed body toward the next stage, where the transformation would no longer be purely visual, but carried into movement, display, and the measured choreography of the procession. Once the body was remade, it had to be shown. Procession was the proof that the transformation wasn't just for the victim's benefit, it was for the community, the gods, and the long memory of both. To parade the condemned was to make their fate a moving spectacle, a lesson carried step by step through the streets, plazas, or fields. In the cities of the Andes, narrow stone paths led from temple courtyards to ceremonial plazas, and the chosen would walk them slowly. Flanked by attendants in matching colors, their pace set to the steady beat of drums or the hollow call of conch shells. In West African traditions, the walk might be accompanied by complex rhythms on talking drums, the patterns carrying messages understood by the crowd, announcements, blessings, or invocations that marked the victim's progress. The movement wasn't random. It was choreography with deep roots, a public ritual in which every turn and pause was loaded with meaning. Sometimes the victim was elevated in parts of Mesoamerica. Raised litters carried by attendants allowed the crowd to see every feather, jewel, and painted line. This wasn't comfort, it was display. A body lifted above the heads of others became an image to be remembered, a living icon paraded like an offering already accepted. In some Pacific Island ceremonies, canoes were used instead, ferrying the adorned figure along a shoreline where crowds waited, the water itself becoming part of the stage. Spectacle required the crowd to participate, even if only through sound. People sang, clapped, ululated, or let loose piercing cries. Some shouted blessings, others curses. It hardly mattered. The noise was part of the energy being built. The path might be lined with flowers, leaves, or symbolic objects to be stepped over, as though the very ground was being remade for the occasion. In certain Mediterranean rites, the procession stopped at predetermined points, where brief offerings were made, libations poured, incense burned before continuing, each pause a station in the ritual journey. Public display wasn't just about reverence, it was also about possession, showing that this life, this body, belonged not to the self, but to the gods and the community's will. The onlookers were witnesses, and their memory was a kind of record-keeping. A sacrifice unseen was incomplete. It had to be marked in the collective consciousness, even if the details blurred over time into legend. The victim's demeanor mattered. In some places, they were expected to walk with calm and dignity, embodying acceptance. In others, outward displays of fear or struggle were seen as part of the drama, amplifying the emotional impact. Either way, the physical journey from one location to another was the visible measure of the narrowing distance between life and its end. By the time the procession reached its destination, be it a temple platform, a sacred grove, or a specially prepared clearing, the air had changed. The crowd had seen, the path had been walked, and the figure at the center was no longer simply a person. They were the event itself, the still point around which the ritual had turned. And as the noise of the procession settled into the controlled soundscape of the ceremonial space, the next stage began, fixing the body in place so it could neither flee nor falter when the final moment came. Arrival at the ceremonial space didn't mean freedom to stand as one pleased. Once the crowd had gathered and the figure was positioned where all could see, the process shifted from movement to control. Restraints weren't an afterthought, they were an essential part of the choreography. The final architectural adjustment to ensure that nothing disrupted the moment the gods had been promised. In the stone-paved courtyards of Central and South America, victims might be guided toward carved pillars or altars fitted with shallow grooves and rings for securing ropes. The cords themselves could be made from twisted maguey fiber, animal sinew, or woven reeds, sometimes decorated with colored tassels so they looked like part of the costume. Arms were pulled behind the back or crossed over the chest, ankles drawn together, positions chosen not only for security, but for the symbolic body shapes they created. In parts of the Pacific, the binding was done with plaited coconut fiber, often anointed with oil so it gleamed in the light and seemed more ritual than restraint. Wooden stocks were also common. In Southeast Asia, large upright frames held victims in a kneeling or standing posture, the wood carved with protective spirits and sacred patterns. The restraint was as much a frame as a prison, turning the bound person into an object of display that could be circled, studied, and addressed during the final prayers. In the Mediterranean world, iron shackles sometimes replaced rope, their cold weight a stark contrast to the ceremonial finery. Immobilization could also be achieved without binding, through posture alone. In some Arctic and subarctic rites, victims were placed in narrow pits or snow-dug hollows, their movement limited by the tight space. Elsewhere, kneeling for long periods on sharp stones or wooden boards rendered the legs numb, effectively pinning the body in place by its own stiffness. This stage wasn't purely physical, it was psychological. The moment the bindings tightened, the last illusion of agency dissolved. The victim was no longer walking, no longer choosing where to turn their head or how to shift their weight. The body became a fixed point in a larger ritual diagram. The attendants might adjust the head's tilt, spread or close the fingers, or position the torso toward the altar, aligning the human figure like a sacred object being prepared for dedication. The crowd's reaction to the binding was part of the script. In some traditions, silence fell, broken only by ritual chants. In others, the noise swelled, voices rising in anticipation, as if the restraint marked the official start of the sacrifice itself. The act of tying down or locking in place was both practical and theatrical, a gesture to the gods, and to the people that nothing could now interrupt what was to come. And yet, restraint was never the last step. The fixed body was still incomplete, still only a container. It had to be awakened spiritually, chemically, or both before the final act could have its full weight. Which is why, after the knots were tied and the last buckle secured, attendants stepped forward with bowls, gourds, or cups, carrying the preparations that would send the victim into the altered state required for the gods to receive them. Once the body could no longer move, the mind became the next canvas. Restraint was not meant to be endured with a clear head. Alteration, whether toward frenzy or trance-wise, essential, and every culture seemed to have its own method for changing the interior weather of the condemned. In the highlands of South America, attendants sometimes approached with a carved wooden cup of fermented maize beer, cloudy and sour on the tongue. It was not enough to intoxicate like a festival drink, but enough to soften the edges, to make the passage from present to past tense feel less abrupt. In coastal regions, chewed coca leaves might be pressed into the victim's mouth, their bitter green pulp numbing the gums and stirring a gentle alertness that masked the body's discomfort. Far from the mountains, in tropical lowlands, a different philosophy prevailed, overwhelmed the senses entirely. Roots containing alkaloids, seeds rich with psychoactive oils, or mushrooms with delicate ghostly caps were ground, steeped, or smoked. The goal was not sedation but transportation, so that the bound figure's mind would already be walking somewhere else before the blade, stone, or fire arrived. In West African rites, kova-like brews made from pepper plants could loosen muscles and thicken speech, leaving the victim both present and strangely distant. In some Pacific Island ceremonies, betel nut chewing served a similar purpose, staining the lips and teeth deep red, a hue that could blur with blood when the final act came, making the moment look seamless. The stimulant lifted the heart rate, flushing the skin, and feeding the sense of being caught in something too large to resist. Not all intoxicants came in cups or bundles. In Arctic regions, where plants were scarce, smoke from burning juniper or specific lichens was used instead. The air grew thick, pungent, and mildly hallucinogenic in enclosed spaces, saturating the victim's lungs with every breath. In Southeast Asia, attendants sometimes placed aromatic resins on glowing coals, letting the scent fill the nostrils until the mind floated toward dreams even while the eyes stayed open. Some preparations weren't about pleasure or relief at all. In parts of the Mediterranean, strong wine was mixed with bitter herbs, creating a drink that made the stomach lurch and the head spin. The logic was simple. Disorientation made resistance unlikely, and in certain shamanic traditions, the chosen were given doses of plants that induced trembling, sweating, and visions, final proof to the onlookers that the spirit world had already claimed them. The delivery of these substances was ritualized. A specific hand passed the vessel, a specific chant was murmured, a specific sequence of sips, chews, or inhales was followed. To an outsider, it might look like kindness offering comfort in the last moments, but to those within the tradition, it was precision work, aligning body chemistry with cosmology so that the human offering would arrive in the other world in the proper condition. By the time the final drop was swallowed, the breath drawn, or the smoke dispersed, the victim's body was bound, their mind adrift, and the space around them thick with the smell of herbs, resins, or fermentation. The preparations had shifted from physical to chemical, and now they would turn fully to the intangible words, chants, and invocations that would carry the offering's name upward, sealing the transition between the living and the divine. With the body restrained and the mind reshaped by drink, smoke, or leaf, there was only one layer left to prepare: the voice of the community. Final blessings weren't whispered to comfort. They were projected to announce the transfer of ownership from human to divine. In the Andes, elders would step forward with staffs or feathered fans, circling the bound figure as they murmured prayers in low, measured tones. Each phrase named the purpose of the offering, invoked the right deities, and requested the right outcomes: rain, harvest, victory, protection. These were not improvised words. They were memorized scripts handed down through generations, with the belief that a single misplaced syllable could sour the entire act. In West African traditions, the final vocal offerings could take the form of calandrespon. A lead singer called out a line naming the victim's qualities, lineage, or symbolic role, and the crowd answered in unison, affirming each declaration. Sometimes the words praised, sometimes they reminded the gods of the debts they owed in return for this life. In Mesoamerican temples, the sound could be overwhelming. Conch shells bellowed low notes, drums rolled like distant thunder, and voices layered on top of one another until the air seemed to shake. The victim stood at the center of this storm of sound, their ears filled with a noise that was half blessing, half command. Elsewhere, in Polynesian ceremonies, chanting was accompanied by deliberate gestures, palms lifted to the sky, hands sweeping toward the ocean, heads bowed in perfect unison. The human form became an extension of the words, every movement reinforcing the sound. In the Mediterranean world, incense smoke might be waved toward the victim with each blessing, the scent carrying the spoken words upward like messengers on the wind. These chants were also practical. They filled the air with an unbroken wall of sound that made conversation impossible, isolating the victim even in a crowd. The mind, already drifting under the influence of intoxicants, could slip more easily into the rhythm, the repetition blurring minutes into something timeless. Some blessings were pointedly personal. In Arctic rites, elders might address the bound figure by name, recalling specific events from their childhood hunts, family milestones before sending them onward. Others kept it entirely symbolic, speaking only in metaphors, comparing the victim to a seed returning to the earth, a star falling into water, a bird whose wings are folded by choice. The chants didn't stop until the signal was given. Sometimes it was a drumbeat cut short, sometimes a sudden silence, sometimes a gesture from the officiant. The abrupt end left the air feeling hollow, charged, as if the sound still vibrated somewhere just out of hearing. That silence marked the exact moment before the transition, the instant where the victim was fully prepared, the gods fully called, and the line between both worlds stretched thinner than a breath. All that remained was the act itself, the culmination toward which every meal, costume, procession, knot, sip, and syllable had been building. But by then, the person at the center was no longer entirely here-bound in body, altered in mind, carried by words into a space where only the gods could answer.